How do you get the most out of your backpacking stove so it boils water fast while using the least amount of fuel? Today I'm doing 4 experiments to test different factors like fuel can level, whether you use a lid or not, and pot diameter affect stove performance. I'm doing the 4 experiments using 3 different stoves, the ultralight leader in the BRS 3000, the MSR Pocket Rocket 2, an oldie but a goodie, and a fan favorite, the Soto Windmaster. I think these stoves provide a good cross-section of stove types with differences in BTUs, burner diameter, and distance from the burner to the top of the stove arms. The Windmaster also has a regulator while the other 2 stoves do not. The first test involves seeing whether having a lid on a pot or not significantly impacts fuel consumption and boil times. Being able to leave a lid at home could be a significant weight savings for some people. As well, I'm doing all the rest of the tests without lids, so we'll see how much of an impact that has on the testing. The first test is pretty straightforward. I'll be bringing 500 milliliters of water to a temperature of 80 degrees Celsius in pots with a lid and pots with no lid. I only completed the lid versus no lid test with the BRS stove and the Windmaster, but I did complete the test using 3 different pots with diameters of 95 millimeters, 115 millimeters, and 145 millimeters. Room temperature is being held at 23 degrees Celsius with no air movement, and the water is being kept at 3 degrees Celsius for consistency. I used large size fuel canisters and a low down stove attachment with the valve open to 50%. For the results, under my testing conditions, there was minimal change in boil time regardless of whether a lid was used or not. In this graph, you can see the BRS boil times in blue and the Windmaster in orange. The darker colors are the times with no lid, and the lighter colors are the times with a lid. There's also a minimal change in fuel consumption, as we can see from this graph. As expected, boil times and fuel consumption are both lower for the Windmaster compared to the BRS. The key takeaway from this test is that having a lid on your pot seems to only really make a big difference if you're dealing with long boil times. For example, if you're dealing with cold temperatures, if you don't have a lot of fuel in your canister, or if you're using an alcohol stove or boiling a lot of water. In those scenarios, it might be worthwhile to have a lid, and it might significantly decrease boil times as well as decrease fuel consumption. The second test involves seeing how much the amount of fuel inside of a fuel canister affects performance of the stove, whether that's boil time or fuel consumption. As you use a stove and the fuel inside of a canister is used up, the pressure inside of the canister decreases, and this may or may not affect different stoves in different ways, especially when it comes to regulated versus unregulated stoves. For this test, I started with a full 110 gram fuel canister for all 3 stoves, and environmental conditions were identical to the first test. It'll be held the same for all 4 tests. I brought 500 milliliters of water to 80 degrees Celsius in a 750 milliliter Toaks titanium pot, and then measured the time it took and the fuel used. I then let the can get back to ambient temperature and repeated until the can was empty. The results of this test were very interesting. The trend that I saw was that the regulated Windmaster maintained pretty consistent fuel consumption and boil time numbers, while the unregulated Pocket Rocket 2 and BRS stoves used more fuel and took less time to boil with a full canister. But as the fuel was used up in the canister, boil times increased, but fuel consumption decreased. Especially with the Pocket Rocket 2, there was a pretty big difference in fuel consumption when the canister was full compared to when the canister was closer to empty. Another interesting result was that the Pocket Rocket 2 and Windmaster only got exactly 11 boils out of a 110 gram canister, while the BRS was able to achieve 12. The key takeaway for the second test is that as fuel levels drop inside of a canister, pressure decreases, which ends up decreasing fuel flow, increases boil time, but also increases fuel efficiency. An interesting observation with this test was that the more BTUs coming out of a stove seemed to result in a lower fuel efficiency. So with the Soto Windmaster, because it's regulated and was constantly putting out pretty high BTUs, it was actually less efficient than the BRS 3000 stove. This test was also representative of other factors that could be influencing fuel can pressure, like temperature as well as altitude. Fun fact, we now have a full database of stoves over on packwizard.com to add to the sleeping pad, tent, bag and quilt, down jacket, and tent databases. I'll be testing almost every stove on the market and adding information to PackWizard like boil times, fuel efficiency, and performance in wind. I'll let you know in a future video when some of that additional testing data has gone live, but in the meantime, you should head over to packwizard.com and check out the current databases, as well as create a gear list. I find creating a gear list helps a ton with my planning for trips, and using the create a checklist feature helps me avoid forgetting items. The third test involves seeing how stove performance is affected by how high it's been turned on. Running a stove at full power is known to decrease fuel efficiency, even though it does decrease boil times as well. But what is the optimal amount to turn your stove on, and how does that affect boil times and fuel efficiency? For this test, I used the MSR Lowdown stove attachments to regulate fuel flow from a 450 gram canister to the stove. Using the lowdown, which is fully open after 2 full rotations of the valve, I turned the stoves to full power and then turned the lowdown valve to 100%, 75%, 50%, and 25% open. For For this test, I also only used the BRS and Windmaster stoves. The results show that boil times go down, but fuel efficiency goes up as fuel flow is reduced. The optimum point is having the valves less open. It seems to be the best balance of boil times and fuel efficiency. The regulated Windmaster didn't see as much of a difference until the valve was reduced to only 25% open. You can also likely get more efficiency by knowing and managing your personal stove to an even lower setting. The key takeaway with this test wasn't really surprising. If you want to maximize fuel efficiency, turn your stove down lower. The lower you turn it down, the more you're going to maximize fuel efficiency. You are going to end up with decreased boil times though. The Soto Windmaster was a little bit of a different story compared to the other two because it is a regulated stove. So we didn't really see that much of a difference with performance for the Windmaster until we started turning the valve really, really low. The fourth test involves seeing how much pot diameter affects performance. This test is interesting because I really want to see whether we can maintain boil times with the water diameter pots while decreasing fuel consumption. We'll also see whether, if there is fuel efficiency, if the weight savings of that fuel efficiency makes up for the fact that the bigger pots and wider pots end up weighing more. To assess how pot diameters affect stove performance, I brought 500 milliliters of water to 80 degrees Celsius in titanium pots with a 95 millimeter diameter, 115 millimeter diameter, and 145 millimeter diameter. The results show that wider pots had progressively lower boil times for both stoves. The difference in boil times between 95 millimeters and 145 millimeter pots was 54 seconds for the BRS and 50 seconds for the Windmaster. Fuel consumption was also lower for the wider pots. The difference in fuel consumption between the 95 millimeter and 145 millimeter pots was 4.1 grams for the BRS and 2.4 grams for the Windmaster. The key takeaway with this test was that whether using a more powerful stove or a less powerful stove, pot diameter both affects boil times as well as fuel consumption. But it may not be worth it for everyone from a weight saving standpoint because with a 110 gram fuel canister and the most narrow pot that we tested, you're gonna get 5 days if you're boiling 500 milliliters of water twice a day. Whereas the widest pot that we tested, you'll get 2 more boils of 500 milliliters, which brings you an extra day out in the backcountry without having to bring another canister. That being said, where it might make a big difference is if you're on the cusp and you're ending up going out for 6 or 7 days, instead of bringing a second fuel canister, you could increase the weight of your pot a little bit, bring one with a wider diameter, and then only need to bring 1 fuel canister. If you like these testing videos, go check out this video right up here where I take 6 tents out into super windy conditions. I set them up and see which ones fail and which ones are able to handle up to 73 km/h winds.